We good? Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this program. I'm confident that it's going to be very interesting, informative, and you'll hear many different perspectives on the topic we're talking about, which is building solar projects on landfills and brownfields, which collectively are called Brightfield projects, so may refer to them as Brightfield projects. My name's Ian Shavitz. I'm the head of the environment and energy practice here at the firm, as well as the renewable energy practice. And wanted to, again, thank everyone for coming. And we're going to have a couple different types of hybrids today. We've got first, this is being done via Zoom. I think we've got 40 or 50 people on Zoom, plus everyone in the room. And the second hybrid aspect is going to be, it's going to be part presentation. And it will be part panel discussion. We're going to keep the presentation really to a minimum because we really want kind of an informal, engaging, discussion period with the folks on the panel. As I said, my goal is to keep this interactive. So feel free in the room to raise your hand during this, or on Zoom to put questions in the chat, and we'll go ahead and ask those. So I wanted to just, go back. As I said, we're going to have two parts of the presentation. First, myself, along with two of my colleagues here from the firm, are going to give overview presentations, really to set the table for the panel discussion. I'll be hitting on some reasons why, in fact, building on brownfields or landfills can be beneficial for really a host of players. And my colleague, Mike Nissengard, will be hitting on some real estate aspects. My colleague Margaret Hathbart will be hitting on some construction and constructability, and then we'll turn it over to our panel for a real kind of back and forth discussion. So I'm going to have my colleagues come up here in a moment, and what we're really going to try to cover today is all aspects of developing projects on brownfields. The first thing that I want to really start on before I introduce my other clients, my other colleagues, is why did we pick this topic? And I think the reason is that first, developing Brightfields projects do provide significant opportunities with benefits that flow really to a whole group of stakeholders, to municipalities, to developers, to landowners, to environmental justice communities, which is really a big push now within New York and within within EPA. So there's a lot of benefits to developing on these types of with these Brightfield projects. And the second is really nothing is for free, right? So while there are those benefits, I think it's very important that people go in with their eyes wide open, so they understand what the potential pitfalls are, what the risks are, and how to avoid them and minimize them. And so I think it's important for that perspective as well. So in terms of the benefits of developing Brightfield projects, I think they're relatively straightforward. The first is that capped landfills, brownfields, they exist. They're all over the place. By one count, there's more than 10,000 closed landfills and an estimated 450,000 brownfields that are lying dormant across the United States. And these are lands that cannot easily be repurposed, right? There's capital that has to go into them. There's sometimes restrictions associated with them. You're not going to be able to build every type of development on those lands. And that's really one of the reasons that solar is great for that. The one thing I want to point out is that EPA has a website or a program called EPA's Repowering America's Lands. And what that really is, it's just a whole catalog and inventory of landfills and brownfields throughout the country that could be suitable for renewable energy development. So it's just, it's a helpful for the developers in the room. It's really a helpful resource to go and see, okay, what might be available, for these types of projects. The second reason that I think it's important and beneficial is that, through reuse of these sites, a property that had been vacant or underutilized can actually become, utilized, which is going to help local tax base. It's going to help create jobs. And in a lot of places, it's going to turn blight into actual economic, opportunities. Many brownfield sites and landfills were located in environmental justice communities and, low-income minority communities. And it's been hard to turn those areas around and have them actually become, useful land that can generate taxes. The other real benefit of it is the ability to avoid building on green fields, building on ag lands, building on open space. I think across New York and really across the country, what we're seeing is a good amount of local opposition to solar projects because it's taking away prime agricultural lands. It's something that certain people don't want to look at. So while it's very good from an environmental perspective, you are going to have opponents reciting at a brownfield site, citing at a landfill site, unlikely to have levels of opposition. The other thing is where brownfields and landfills are located. They're generally located, near population centers. There's good roadway access. There's usually interconnection close by because these were used for industrial purposes. Some landfills are already doing renewable energy like methane, capture. So there are opportunities, and it makes, and this is probably something that Dan will cover as a developer. One thing that developers are going to look at is they're going to look at abilities to interconnect, right? Do we have to go far, acquire property, get a long right of way, and subject ourselves to additional cost approvals, land acquisition, or can we shorten that and thus save ourselves cost, permitting, et cetera. And then the last point, and this is something that Don will cover, and I'll introduce our panelists shortly, is there's financial incentives, right? Through Brownfields program in New York State, for example, there's financial incentives, tax incentives. EPA has grants, and Marty will cover that in a little bit. So actually cleaning up a site, if we're talking about a brownfield, locating on a landfill, there are real incentives that are going to help make your projects pencil out and be economically feasible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mike Nissengard. Mike concentrates his practice on commercial real estate and renewable energy matters, where he routinely handles issues involving the structure and negotiation of all phases of real estate development projects located in New York and throughout the country. A significant part of Mike's practice involves counseling on real estate aspects of renewable energy projects. I turn to Mike to all the projects that I work on a permitting and on the environmental front. I tag team with Mike, and he handles whether it's a purchase, whether it's a lease, whether it's an option. He is great at handling the real estate pieces. And so he advises on site control, power purchase agreements, real property agreements, and conducts diligence on those projects. So in a moment, I'll bring Mike up, and that'll be followed by Margaret Hackbarth, who's going to cover construction issues. Margaret has 30 years of experience in construction real estate development. She served as an in-house counsel for a variety of companies, including mixed-use real estate development, construction company, and a publicly traded home builder. She regularly advises clients on construction contracts, risk management strategies, operational matters, including workers' comp, safety and OSHA, mechanics liens, surety bonds, and project closeout, and many of those in the context of constructing on brownfield sites. So with that, let me turn it over to Mike to give us about 5 minutes on real estate.
Thanks, Ian. As you said, my name is Mike Nissengard. I'm a real estate attorney with experience in renewable energy projects. I just want to quickly touch on 3 matters which are with respect to real property development of solar projects on brownfields and landfills that set these projects aside from your typical solar development. To start with number 1, due diligence. In addition to the typical due diligence documents you're going to want to review, such as survey, title, environmental, and wetlands reports, it's also important to get the documents that govern the brownfield or the landfill. Your brownfield cleanup agreement, site management plan, landfill permits. If there's any ongoing OM&Ms or operations, maintenance, and monitoring responsibilities, you're going to want to know those obligations up front, which leads me to my second point, obligations under the site control documents. Under a lease, you're going to want the landlord to maintain these responsibilities in the solar project going forward. Likewise, you're going to want the tenant or the solar developer, solar operator, not to have these obligations going forward. A slight wrinkle to that is with these obligations, the landlord's going to want access, or typically will want access to the leased premises. In a regular solar development, it's all hands off. But with these obligations, the landlord will typically need access to monitor or maintain or otherwise comply with the requirements that are subject to the Brownfield property. Third issue, now that we've touched on obligations, are indemnities. What if those obligations aren't met? Well, you'll want the landlord to indemnify you for anything that goes astray there that wasn't a result of any tenant activities. And related to that, it's also proper to ask the landlord to indemnify you for past and present environmental contamination, environmental conditions, as well as future conditions which the tenant did not cause. Again, these are just three quick matters which make a typical fun solar project a little bit more exciting. I think solar development on Brownfields is really it's a great opportunity, has great potential. It really makes for, like I said, very exciting projects. And continuing with that air of excitement, Margaret Hackbarth is going to come up and just discuss a few construction issues related to these projects.
Thank you. So when one is undertaking one of these projects, as a threshold matter, when you're selecting your team who's going to move the dirt and install the equipment, I would recommend doing an RFP. That way you can think about all of the requirements that Michael is referencing and that Ian has referenced, incorporate those into an RFP, and make sure that your contractor who's bidding on it commits to satisfying all of those requirements and can show you their level of expertise in these projects. These projects really are not for, like, I know a guy did really good work with this guy on these other, greenfield projects. I would say I would consider finding somebody who's worked on brownfield projects, because there are a lot of other things to think about related to liability, indemnity, and safety, frankly, that might come into play. And so I'd select contractors that are experienced, have the necessary expertise in-house if possible. They're financially sound, right? They can stand behind their indemnity, right? They have appropriate insurance, so they can get these higher level, more sophisticated levels of insurance. They have access to that, so that, again, if there's a problem, they can step forward and cover you on those and themselves on the liabilities. Also, they have the required bonding capacity. Bonds are typically required in these sorts of projects if there's federal funding or other public funding. But also, don't forget, an owner on one of these projects is most likely giving a personal guarantee or some level of guarantee for performance and completion of these projects, and the collection of those tax credits if those are involved, and satisfying the requirements under a grant. So the contractor you've got coming in has to have a certain amount of bonding capacity, and that tells you a lot about their financials. I'd also pick somebody who's really good with the community, right? Your contractor can take you a long way with your community if they are performing and keeping the site clean. They're communicating well, they're responding to complaints or claims quickly, and that can keep everybody happy. And I know you all want that. And then with respect to contracting, you have to think about who has privity with this owner, right? You're going to have designers, engineers, the contractor, equipment suppliers, inspection companies, construction manager if you've got an EPC or design build project going. And so you want to make sure you think about that, think about your form of agreement, and very, very key, flow down the requirements from your lenders, investors, grants, and others involved, flow those down through your contracts. It's time consuming, but worth the investment. And then I would say that there are a whole host of things that you need to keep in mind. Keep in mind that there might be different safety requirements, different OSHA requirements, even during the course of performance. And then you need to really, really think about who's taking liability. If a contractor finishes and you don't get those tax credits at the end, who's bearing the liability for that? Or if they disturb contaminants that are left in the soil, perhaps outside of the limits of disturbance, what will happen? Are they prepared to respond? And so with that, there's so many things we could talk about, but I want to turn it over to the team. But I would just say, know your documents, flow down the requirements, and communicate well with your team and the community.
Great. Well, as I said, I wanted to have this be, interactive. We just wanted to kind of set the table with that. And now for the balance of today, we're going to turn to our panel, who come at this from very different perspectives. So first, we have at the end Dan Montante. Dan is president and co-founder of Montante Solar, where he's overseen the company's rapid growth into becoming a key player in New York, the New York solar market. Dan's responsible for overseeing company operations, strategic direction, and client satisfaction and retention. Dan also sits on the board as vice president of the New York Solar Energy Industries Association. To Dan's left is Marty Doster. Marty's a professional engineer and serves as a senior environmental advisor here at Lippis Mathias. He has over 35 years of experience in the fields of hazardous waste remediation. And before joining our firm, Marty was the regional engineer for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, Division of Environmental Remediation for Western New York, where he spent close to 30 years essentially as the regulator, running the New York Superfund program and Brownfield cleanup program. Finally, we have Don Warrant. Don is director of Freed Maxic's tax practice. He has over 30 years of public accounting experience with a broad background in manufacturing and distribution, real estate, construction, retail and wholesale trade, agribusiness, hospitality, and professional services. And Don specializes in various federal, state, and local tax credits, which is keys right into the Brownfield program, as well as opportunity zones, the work opportunity tax program, rehabilitation tax credit program, and the New York State Excelsior Jobs program. So let me kick it off with a question, and I'm going to start with Marty. Marty, this is really two questions for you. Okay, you've been, I didn't include in your bio that you've been an adjunct professor at University of Buffalo. So I want you to put on your teaching hat. And I want you to just briefly, for those that aren't familiar with the Brownfield cleanup program, can you give a brief overview of what a brownfield is, as well as touch on New York's program and touch on EPA's program? And then the second question is, I'm going to have you put on your environmental regulator hat. And Dan Montante comes into you and he says he wants to enroll a site in the Brownfield cleanup program. He's going to clean it up. He's going to build a solar project on it. From a regulator's perspective, do you like and support this use? What are your concerns, if any, when Dan comes to you with that? So I'll start with Marty with the overview.
Sure. Thanks, Ann. So to kind of frame the Brownfields conversation, I think one has to go back and understand how that all came about. And it came about in the late 70s where we had something called Love Canal here in Western New York, which was a contaminated property, and there were no rules, no laws on the books to even address what to do with contaminated property, what to do with people that were harmed by it. If we needed to move them out, where did that money come from? And who was responsible? And so in the late 70s, that all started happening. And in 1980 is when we started to get the first circular laws, which we call Superfund. And that's the law that basically says that if you contaminated a piece of property with a hazardous waste that was threatening the environment or human health, if you owned the property, didn't contaminate it, but you owned it and allowed people to contaminate it, or you transported the material to that place, you were liable. And not only were you liable going back to the 1940s, when it was certainly proper to do so. So it was a very strict law, and it held everybody liable. So if somebody only put one drum of material there, but the guy down the street put 10,000, the one with the one drum had the same liability as the one with the 10,000. So it's a pretty tough law, and that was called Superfund and CERCLA. You can imagine what they did for the property values in the Rust Belts of the United States. I'm not touching that piece of property. It may not be a Superfund site, but I don't know, and I'm not going to be liable. And everybody fled the inner cities, and they kind of vacated places like Buffalo and Utica and Chicago and Ashtabula. These places, nobody would touch the property. And there was a chill throughout the 80s as the attorneys and the government and everybody tried to figure out liability and how the courts would rule on this. So fast forward to that is in the 90s, governments, especially state governments, started trying to figure out how can we put incentives in place to get these tainted properties, not really Superfund level quality properties, but tainted properties, and put some incentives in place. And there's kind of three incentives that come with all state programs. Some give money, like New York State. There's a tax incentive to kind of level the playing field. Number two is a release of liability, because you need that, so the banks will finance it, and they will accept these certificates from these governments. And three was timing. Nobody, if you're going to build a Tim Hortons on a corner gas station, you can't wait the 5 or 6 years that it typically would take to make its way through a cleanup program. So timing was of the essence as well. A lot of states went with licensed professionals, where they took charge of the programs, and the government kind of sat back and relied on the professionals to certify that the cleanups are done properly. So every state in the union has some kind of a brownfield program, and overarching that was the US EPA also coming up with grant money, mainly to municipalities, to start to designate areas and start to study areas and try to get these studies underway to identify brownfields and start to come up with a plan at the municipal level of planning of how to deal with those. That's how the landscape kind of played out. Now here we are with folks like Dan, who are looking and trying to find brownfields, large tracts of brownfields, not the 1 acre sites, but the 30, 40 acre sites that could actually put something like a solar field farm on those. And lo and behold, places like Western New York and other places have large areas like this. Unfortunately, most of them are privately owned still. So an example here in Buffalo is the Bethlehem Steel site. 1,900 acres of former steel plant site that went bankrupt in the 80s and kind of was held by a holding corporation. Part of it was made a Superfund site, but the vast majority of the site was brownfield. Brownfield meaning it's tainted, not really sure what's there. I don't know if we want to go there. And to their credit, to the holding company, at the urging of the regulator at the time, entered the brownfield program for almost 1,000 acres, well, about 500 acres of the property. And they entered into the program, did the studies, come up with the cleanup plans, and made that available to developers to develop on. And so that's an example close to home here in Buffalo, New York, of how that program would work. So I'll pause there.
Yep. So now let me turn to Dan. Dan, we know that Marty, the regulator, he's bought in, right? He sees the benefits of getting this site redeveloped. And now you have to design and build the project. Okay. So my question is, aside from the financial incentives, Don will handle those in a minute. What's the difference? Why is it different? What do you need to consider building on let's stick with brownfields. We'll turn to landfills later, but building on a brownfield as opposed to building on a greenfield?
Well, I'm going to answer your question, but I'm first going to just talk a bit about why I think brownfields are actually a great place to put a solar project. Anyone who's picked up the newspaper recently and has picked up and read any article about citing a project in New York State, you're going to read about a lot of pushback from the local communities. Brownfield sites, they typically are old industrial sites that have a lot of great attributes associated with them. They're typically flat. They typically have, above ground structures have been raised. So there's no shading, number one. And number two, and this is so critical, they're typically very close to three-phase power. You didn't need, one essential ingredient to a successful solar project is being close to the grid. Contrast like an old industrial site to a rural area in northern New York, where you may not have three-phase power. You might have all the land in the world, but you just don't have the infrastructure there to support it. Industrial sites are great because they have that infrastructure already in place. It makes the project on one level easier to build, at least from the utility perspective. But then you do have to deal with the reality of what is still there or what was there. And then you have to, then you start getting into the planning and the due diligence process. Margaret, I think you spoke a bit about due diligence on the site, and that phase is incredibly important when looking at a brownfield site. Getting into the phase one, the phase two, geotechnical analysis. You really do need to understand what's like, what the corrosivity of the soil is. That might impact how you design a foundation system. And you do have to look forward to engaging more agencies than you normally would. You're going to have to work with the DEC, very likely, depending on what stage of the project you're entering. And those timelines are going to be extended as compared to a typical project that you're citing on a greenfield. Getting into the planning, or like in terms of how you select and how you're going to build the system, oftentimes you're not going to want to penetrate the ground. Sometimes there are caps. Sometimes there's just corrosion concerns about putting a steel post into the ground. So you're often building with a ballasted racking system, and there's going to be additional costs. So at this phase of the project, you really need to sharpen your pencils and make sure you have a very robust pro forma that you're constantly updating, so you have a good idea of what your development expenses are going to be, what your cost to construct is going to be, all the while trying to move the project site along. Once you are entering the phase of constructing the project, there are some things you're going to need to be aware of. You do need to have contingency plans. If you are excavating in the ground, you're putting an electrical pole in, for instance, and you're going to have to do some basic excavation. There might be some contamination that will come up, and you're going to have a plan for how you handle that. How's it going to be quarantined? How's it going to be stored? How's it going to be transported and tested? You have to have a plan, and it all has to be budgeted. Citing a project on a brownfield is very similar to citing a project anywhere else, except you have to invest a lot more time in the due diligence and the development cycle of the project. You should anticipate some extra time, but also recognize that if you do everything right during development and pre-construction, you should be rewarded with a very good project that pencils nicely.
Great, thanks, Dan. And one of the hats I wear is development counsel. And so I have many development clients or developer clients, and when they hear things like cost for cleanup, it's going to take longer, those types of things, that's, couldn't be worse for a developer, right? The thing that kills projects: time, delays, costs, right? So then let's turn to Don a minute. So Dan now comes to you, says, Don, I have the support of the regulator. I figured out my design and construction issues, but I need to understand if it pencils out and if it's economically viable, because on a greenfield site, Dan's not going to have to do these types of things. So what would you tell Dan about how the brownfield cleanup program works from a dollars and cents perspectives, and how or if the numbers work out for a solar project? And I know, Don, you're going to be speaking about New York State's program. As Marty mentioned, there are different programs throughout the country, some that use tax incentives and financial incentives like New York, others that use different ones. So this will be New York, but you're going to find some derivation of this in most states. And Don, Dan's not a CPA. Most people in this room are not CPAs, so you're gonna have to dumb it down for us just a tad. So what do you tell Dan when he asks you, is this gonna pencil out?
Well, first thing I'd ask Dan is, can you share your budget with me? Because that's going to be where we begin is let's look at what your costs are. And I suppose we could compare that between a brownfield and a greenfield and give you that type of a comparison. But the incentive here, really, New York State, as Marty mentioned, is trying to incentivize the cleanup of these contaminated areas. And they do that through what they call these refundable tax credits. So to the extent that you're going to spend money to clean up the soil, New York State is effectively going to reward you with a tax credit. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's something that you would claim on your tax return, on your New York State tax return, to the extent that it exceeds your tax liability, which typically these types of credits do. You get a check back from New York State. So it's almost like a return on your investment from the state. And it varies. So there's different components to the brownfield program in New York State. There's 3 components to it. There's what they call a site preparation credit. There's a groundwater component. And then there's a tangible property component. So the first component that you go into is to clean up the soil. First, you go out there and you find that it's contaminated. You approach the DEC and say, okay, we've got contaminated ground here. Can we enter the program? They say, sure, here you go. Here's what you need to do to get a certificate. And then you proceed from there. So to me, that's one of the biggest things is really understanding what your costs are going to be to clean up that ground. Is it going to be maybe just $500,000? Is it going to be $2.5 million? That's really going to drive the financial incentive here to do a project on a brownfield. So it's really important to understand just how contaminated is it and how much time and cost is it going to take to clean up that ground, and then how do you get rewarded for that on the back end. So staying with the site preparation credit for a moment, the percentages vary. So it depends on what you want to do on the site. So if we're talking about putting solar panels on a site, you're not going to have a lot of human interaction with the site. So you're probably going to be looking at the lower end of the tax credits. And for the site preparation component, it starts at 22%. So what that means is that whatever you spend, every dollar you spend, potentially you could expect a return back from New York State of 22 cents. It goes as high as 50 cents. So to the extent that you're going to put a daycare, a school, a hospital, something like that on the site, you'd be looking at the 50% credit rate. So that's the site preparation credit. And also the groundwater component kind of marries in with the site preparation. Then you have the tangible property credit. So you're going to put solar panels on the site. That's tangible property. That's depreciable. So New York State looks at that and says, there's costs going into the site. It's tangible, hard costs. We're going to reward you again with a tax credit. And it's the same thing. It's a refundable tax credit. And here again, the rates vary depending on the type of site that you're putting the property on. So it starts at a base rate of 10%, and it can grow to as high as 24%. And talking about a solar project, let's just throw it out there and say, it's going to be 10%. In the governor's budget, though, she's proposing that you might get a 5% kicker, so it could be maybe 15%. So one of the important things to think about here is the timing of when you incur these costs. As I mentioned, you approach DEC, you get into an agreement. So what you kind of want to do is, as much as possible, is hold off your costs until you get the agreement with DEC, because the dollars you spend before you get the agreement wouldn't qualify for these tax credits. So you're really looking for deferral of the timing of incurring the costs until you're into the program with the DEC, and then you'll get rewarded with the tax credits.
Can I interrupt you 1 second?
Sure.
Yeah. So Don said something interesting right in the beginning for Dan, and that is you're looking at a 40-acre parcel, former industrial property, and Dan's question is, how much is it going to cost to clean up? Because his accountant is saying, you got to give me the numbers of what it's going to cost to clean up so I can run the numbers and tell you if it's going to pencil out. Dan's saying, okay, let's do that. But you know what? I only want to spend about $10,000 studying a 40-acre site. So he's going to go to an engineer, and the engineers in the office know, or in the audience know this. He's going to go to the engineer and say, I got $10,000. I'm going to put 3 wells in, take 10 samples, and I want you to tell me down to a gnat's eyebrow how much it's going to cost me to clean up. Impossible task, right, to do. But that is where, really getting good talent early in the beginning with the consultants you hire, so that they can assess a piece of property. They've got experience in knowing a certain type of cleanup or the kind of industry they're cleaning up, because they can, with smaller sets of data, be able to estimate what they might be, making your accountant happy. Have you had that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having a pro forma that you are constantly updating. pick the site, we have one that's always being updated. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the site prep cost is a driver for what your actual credits can be. And that's a critical element. And, the quality of team is essential, it's important to note that you're not working with just one person to get all this done. You are going to have a team to make it effective. And the engineering side, that's going to be critical as well.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. So now let's move on to landfills.
Can I just add one thing?
You absolutely can.
To Don's comments. I think Don did a nice job covering the BCP tax credits that are associated with building a potential solar project. NYSERDA also does provide special inducements to site projects on industrial sites. They have what they call the Brownfield adder, which right now is the only incentive for solar projects in New York State above a certain size. And between the BCP refundable tax credits and the NYSERDA Brownfield adder, you have projects that pencil very nicely now. It's something just to be aware of, that there's different support from different agencies, both at the federal level, the state level, and then even at the local level.
Yeah, and I think you're going to find throughout the country more and more states that are going to be incentivizing these types of development, right? Land is finite, clean open space land is finite, and then but there's a big push. Obviously, we see it from the Biden administration down into various state administrations to increase renewable energy, reduce carbon footprint, reduce reliance on fossil fuels. So I think just the political forces are going to push for more renewable energy development, and the states are going to incentivize it because they want it, but they're also going to try to steer it to the places where it's going to be most beneficial. And that's where I think why we're going to see brownfields being utilized. And I think we're going to see, we are seeing landfills. So I'm going to turn to landfills now. Dan, this question's for you, and it's the same question I had for you before. Tell us how, if at all, planning, designing, and building a project on a landfill is going to differ from building on a green field or on an agricultural land. And then once you answer, I'm going to tell you from a legal perspective how I see it as different and what I'm looking for as your lawyer to manage your risks in the lease, in a power purchase agreement, or some other transaction document that's going to be in place for you to go ahead and build a project on a landfill.
I would say our due diligence process that we run on a landfill as compared to a typical brownfield is very similar. However, we will spend a lot more time looking at the landfill closure report. And that's the report that's filed with the DEC that basically details the specifications of the landfill, how it was capped, how it needs to be maintained, and what sort of ongoing obligations the owner has to conduct to keep the landfill intact. So you're working with generally the same agencies, but you do need to formally modify that landfill closure report. There's a process to that, and it takes time. And at the end of the day, you're going to be interacting with DEC a lot more. So the one thing I would say is that from a development perspective, it's to keep in mind the development timelines. And again, always have that pro forma handy and updated, because there are probably a dozen critical factors that drive the financial success of a solar project that are always moving. So just keep that pro forma live, and recognize that you need a longer runway in terms of timeline to get the project done.
Yep. And I think, Dan, you've kind of covered the things that I'm going to look at as I'm advising a client who's looking to build, on a landfill. Many of these landfills are municipally owned. They're municipal landfills. And so what we have is we have a closure plan, or we have a closure permit, and the permittee, the holder of that permit, is going to be the municipality. Right, so the municipality is going to have many obligations associated with, with the landfill, and that's really in the diligence stage. We're going to look at the landfill plan, and we're going to look at the closure plan. We're going to see, is this use allowed? Sometimes, there's no uses that are going to be allowed. Do we need to amend the plan to allow for the use? Are there constraints on development? Are there institutional controls? Are there certain areas that cannot have any sort of infrastructure placed on it. We're also going to look at, and this is kind of beyond what we're talking about today, but certain geotechnical things, weight bearing and so forth.
The equipment we use. Is
Right.
We typically are using tracked vehicles and not anything with tires. You have to be very, like, the whole way you stage your equipment, how you get the equipment to the site, weight all of a sudden becomes a major thing you have to consider, which you never would even consider on a greenfield site. So.
And I think, I along those lines, I'm going to then turn to my, real estate colleague, Mike, and I'm going to ask him for me to take a look at the lease or whatever the, whatever the contract is. Oftentimes it will be a lease. Sometimes it'll be a power purchase agreement. Someone's going to build, on a municipal landfill, and they're going to sell the power to the municipality. And, there's sometimes in those power purchase agreement, there's going to be a license as opposed to a lease, which Mike may have some concerns about because in fact, there may be financeability issues with respect to a license that you don't have the level of real estate interest that you really need. But what I'm going to look at is I'm going to see who's responsible under the closure plan. I'm going to see who's responsible if the cover system tends to come up. There's, leaching material. I'm going to look at, whether there's any other additional institutional controls or limitations in the lease to make sure that actually this project, can be built. And third, like any other transaction, I'm going to look at the risks. I'm going to look at liabilities. I'm going to look at indemnities, and I'm going to make sure the risks are allocated equitably. And here is where, you do have actually, there's some benefits to being on a landfill, for example. We're not going to have a, Dan is going to develop there. He's not going to be worried about having, environmental liability concerns. He's not worried about DEC coming back to him because he was an owner or lessee or operator, on this site. Right, he's allowed to be there. He doesn't own it, and we know there's contamination there. It's a landfill. So I would say it's a much easier line in the sand than a traditional project as to who's going to take on the risk, the environmental liabilities, the indemnifications, and so forth. So now, Marty, I'm going to turn to you. You've been involved with landfill permitting, closures, from the regulatory side. What unique considerations should a developer be aware of when they're locating a project on a landfill?
Sure, and Dan touched on it, the weight bearing. I mean, the basics about a landfill is this, right? We consolidate all the waste material, get it as tight as we can. We put an under drain system in, and then we cover it and cap it. And capping usually is a plastic membrane that is put down, and then that we protect that plastic membrane with a foot or two or more of fill material, clean soil, things of that sort, sand, to protect that membrane. That's why when you go to a landfill, you don't see trees growing on a landfill, and that's why they mow the landfills, because they don't want trees growing, because trees, the root structures will actually penetrate the plastic. Once you penetrate the cap, you've now allowed water to go into it, and that creates a lot of leachate, which has to be treated, and that's a migratory problem for you in terms of migration and contamination.
Excuse me, Marty, I'm going to interrupt you one moment, and that's another advantage. One of the problems and difficulties developing on, let's say greenfields or, or more open space is cutting down of trees, right? I mean, trees serve obviously many environmental benefits. People like to see them. They, help from an air quality perspective, and they serve as habitat for, many different species. What comes to mind here in the Northeast is the Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat. Right, as you're going to have restrictions on what trees you can cut, when you can cut them, those types of things, where you're not going to have those, on a landfill, just by virtue of it being a landfill. And Marty's point that it could cause issues below. Right. So Marty, sorry to jump in. As a regulator,
I would just look at Dan and say, look at there's a closure plan. They did a good job. Don't mess this up. And that's really what we'd send you on your way with, is don't mess this up. So his job is to really make sure that they don't put ruts in the landfill, and they don't penetrate through that cap structure and things of that. And there'll be a lot of testing and oversight that will go along with that. The interesting thing is, we focused on the landfill, and we had an interesting project one time where they were building out the landfill, and then but we have to get the power off the landfill onto the grid. And to do that, we had to go off the landfill through what turned out to be a contaminated area.
This
So,
sounds familiar.
yeah, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? So
That's like
a little twist to this, right? Because, usually landfills are not in a nice suburban area. They are typically located pretty close to the industrial areas that they were serving. So, so the proximity and the areas around that, we need to kind of think about that and make sure that we have the right pathways to get our power off the site. And if it's going to be an impediment, we work through that before we start.
So
putting solar panels.
Just a comment, Marty and I have worked together in the past on one project in particular. This was a landfill project. And we had, this was everything was going to be ballasted, no penetrations in the ground except for 3 poles, 3 utility poles. And we put the auger in the ground for the first pole, and I'm not exaggerating, within 5 minutes up comes some sort of contamination. So that stopped all work for a period of time. Anyway, we worked with Marty. Marty's got great experience with the DEC to kind of help us navigate, how we resolve this. What became evident to me in the process is that while the DEC might be perceived as this big bureaucratic organization, maybe it is, you got the sense that there was a willingness to collaborate and find a workable solution. Like they were working to find a successful end to this issue. And that was encouraging. It was actually, it was encouraging to see. And it was helpful to be, to have a little handholding to navigate that. But yeah, it's the stuff doesn't stay where you want it to be all the time.
Ryan asked me a question early on. My second question, what I never got the chance to do is, as a regulator, how I would treat him. But the thing about a regulator, especially when, look at, we're protecting the environment. The regulator is charged of protecting the environment. So, and when you couple that with lucrative tax credits that's coming from the taxpayer of the state, their job is to make sure that they're getting a good cleanup. And so really, that's the way they're looking at this, is making sure that we get a good cleanup on that site so that it takes away any migration problems and it's protective of public health. And if you're in an environmentally sensitive area, we're protected there. Other than that, it's a straightforward program. They embrace renewables, absolutely. It's coming on from the top on down, from the governor on down in New York, and that. So they would embrace the project for sure and find a solution to your problem.
Great, thanks, Marty and Dan. So, all sounds rosy with landfills and brownfields, and we're going to go right out and just develop them. But there's some pitfalls, right? There's some things you need to know. There's some things you need to look for. So, Don, you started to hit on this before. What are some of the mistakes that a developer could make that would preclude them from taking maximum advantage of the financial incentives under the Brownfield program? And Dan, I'm going to ask you a similar question in a moment about mistakes, about the difficulties that you've encountered or the developers could encounter.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I don't know that it's a mistake, but just really the timing of when you start incurring your costs. Just want to do the minimum upfront with DEC and then start incurring your costs for your cleanup in your changeable property. After that, pre-order your equipment and that type of stuff, because it's that date that you enter into the agreement with DEC that qualifies you for the refundable New York State income tax credits. And as we were talking about Dan and his project, it's the budget as well. So it makes sure that you go into it knowing what you believe your costs will be, so we can pencil that out. And then we can continue to monitor that, make sure we track those costs going forward, because 100% of these credit claims are audited by New York State. So if you want to accelerate your audit and your cash payment, you want to make sure you're tracking your costs as you're incurring them and putting them in the right place on your schedules so that it facilitates the whole process right through the end.
Great, thanks, Don. So Dan, nothing's perfect. Can you discuss any circumstances where developing a bright field project, so whether landfill or brownfield, hasn't worked out, and what are the lessons learned? Or what are you going to go in doing different the next time?
I think I'm just going to I'm repeating myself, but project timeline. We've had a handful of projects go south where, fundamental economics has shifted. And, the reality is that if you have to start with a site that has not been cleaned up, that you have to put it, enter it into the program, do the cleanup, get your certification complete, and then build your project, that's a minimum, 18-month time frame probably. you have to, and then you start the solar project. We've had projects that have gone south where things have just changed. Some fundamental element has changed, whether it be a power rate or just motivation to get the project done. NIMBYism still does exist with brownfield sites. The way these sites are used may not, they may be old industrial sites, but the way they're being used currently might, it might be, people might enjoy walking their dogs there now. And NIMBY, home rule, New York is a home rule state where zoning boards and planning boards will listen, very clearly, listen very well to the people that don't want the projects around. So some of the traditional NIMBYism that precludes traditional solar projects also shoots down projects that are going to be sited on brownfields. But the project timeline, the development timeline, that's the real tricky part to navigate.
Yeah, and I think, we're seeing there's various counties in New York State and probably throughout the country where there's actually solar moratoria in place because there hasn't been planning. People have just been, spot dropping these projects on agricultural fields, on open space. And in New York and other places where you have home rule, where essentially you have at the municipal level, decision making, what you're going to have is you're going to have these people who, the town board, they're at the shopping, the grocery store with people, they're at church with people, and they're going to be hearing all of our land is being taken up by these, by these solar projects. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a moratorium in place. We're going to think about a way to, to plan kind of zoning for solar, if you will. And I think what's going to come out of those efforts is exactly this. It's going to be drive the development to where it, to where it makes sense. So again, you may be as great as it may be, or as many benefits as there may be to choose a brownfield or a landfill, you may be forced to do that because there's not going to be other lands in a specific area where you're going to, where the energy can be used that will be approved or approvable for solar. So we have a question from the chat. It says, what is the threshold for cleanup costs that make solar still viable? Also, what's the smallest brownfield landfill that makes financial sense for solar? Now, I don't know if you can answer that exact question, but what might be some of the factors that would make, that would, cause it not to be economically feasible to develop a certain, to develop a project under the brownfield cleanup program? And I'll put it out to all three of you gentlemen.
It's a good question. It's a loaded question because no one site is, every site is different. I will say there are probably no landfills that are too small. I would say that you do need probably a minimum project, like a minimum acreage to make a ground mount project work. And that would probably be about an acre, at least 2 would be better. Small projects, interestingly enough, do work in New York quite well. It's the larger projects that are becoming more challenging on occasion. With regards to, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. What is the minimum cost to clean up?
Well, I don't think it's the minute. It's
Let me
the
take a stab at that one.
the threshold for cleanup
Yeah.
costs.
Yeah, so we need to understand in New York State anyway, how the brownfield taxes work. So, so I'm gonna use round numbers. So I'm gonna do $1 million cleanup. $1 million cleanup generates a 30% return tax credit on the cleanup. So you get $300,000 back from the government on your $1 million cleanup. It also sets the stage for how much you can get on the tangible side. So it's three times the $1 million. So you can get a cap of $3 million. I assume it's the three times for these guys, right? For solar, right?
It is,
That's
but the 3 times is the credit amount, not the cost amount.
Correct. That's right. Not the credit. So you get up to $3 million of the tax credit cap. So now you can see how you can back calculate, say, how many solar panels am I putting up? How big is this field? And can I use all 3 million of that? If I need more, I need to do more cleanup. And this gets back to this conversation about right in the beginning, you should kind of guesstimate what the costs of cleanup are going to be. So it drives your tangible property return. and vice versa. So there is no answer to that question. What is the smallest number? It really is a function of both knowing what your capital costs are to build this out versus the cleanup costs. And there's a question to that.
I guess I have a related question. Historically, one of the highest costs for remedial design is obviously electricity. You have to run pumps and strippers and things like that. Do you incorporate in any remedial designs nowadays solar so that you can actually use the power that's produced from the site to drive the cleanup?
It's a good question. I have not seen that to date. I don't know how much power usage a typical landfill would consume to power those pumps. But typically these are municipal projects that you're developing, and oftentimes the buyer of the electricity is that same municipality. So there is a virtual powering of that landfill at the same time. It really kind of depends, I think. But I would say any project we've done on a landfill, it's been the municipality has actually taken the power and in part has used it to power the landfill that the site was that the solar was sited on.
Great, sir.
Question for Don, my colleague. So Don, the idea of a refundable credit from New York State up to 50%, I guess, in some cases, it sounds great. They're going to write you a check. What does the IRS and the federal tax code have to say about the receipt of that refund?
Yeah, to the extent that it's actually received in the form of a payment to you, the federal government will tax that. So, we factor that into our calculations as to what the benefit is potentially of doing a brownfield project.
So significant, they could share in a third of your reward or more.
Correct.
In New York State.
Yes.
Dan, do you have a follow-up?
I actually have a question for Don. I know in the audience today, we have a number of individuals who represent municipalities. Municipalities often are landowners that often have brownfield sites, some of which have been remediated. All those sites will certainly earn an NYSERDA adder. But with regards to BCP tax credits, if the municipality, say they run an RFP to get rid of some land, but they don't want to dispose of it, they want to maintain ownership of the land and somehow recoup a ground lease fee or something. How can those tax credits transfer to the project owner or developer? Like, is there a mechanism that works easily to facilitate that so that the tax credits aren't just forfeited?
Marty, I don't know if you have a response to that, but I do know that they would have to be a party to the agreement.
That's the easiest way. Is what Don's meaning is, as part of the cleanup on a brownfield site, you would come in as leasing the property, but you should be on the agreement so that those tax credits can easily flow to you.
But oftentimes the cleanup may have already been done. And in those situations, we've completed a project where we're wrapping up a project with Erie County on a brownfield site. My question is, obviously, the site was cleaned up, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago. We were certainly not party to the agreement with the DEC. In those sorts of situations, is there a way or a mechanism to become party of those tax credits?
That's a complicated answer. So I think you can. Dan, do you know by any chance if that ever happened to you? Because my understanding is you can be added later on to the agreement later on. But it's not clear to me whether the tax credits would flow directly to them.
I think the issue really is, first of all, you have to have a taxpayer. So you have to have somebody that's tax paying to claim the credits. That's kind of what the issue that we're talking about right now. And then secondly is the site cleanup costs. Who cleaned up the site? What did they pay? Because that sets your cap on your tangible. So you kind of want to look back to the history there to see what they spent and who did the work, to see if I enter into the agreement, become a party to the certificate, can I secure that cap and how much is left? Because that's going to set what I can claim as far as tangible property. It's probably all doable, even if the municipality cleaned up the site. But that I think we're getting into the DEC regulations on the certificate.
Yeah, but the simple answer to your question is it can be amended. The certificate can be amended. You can be added but now we need to get into the details of how much tax credits really there.
Right, and Marty, if Dan is added.
Yep.
Does he get the benefit of the liability protections that the
Yes.
Brownfields program
He
provides?
gets the benefit of that, but he also gets the burden. If the underlying responsible party goes away, he's now got the burden of making sure that that closure plan is implemented.
Is
correctly.
implemented, okay. I think I saw one more question, Greg?
This may be a question for Dan, but is there a set of factors that you look at sort of in the initial stages of the project and say, okay, we have this, and this, and these are critical as to whether or not the project goes forward?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, I'll just jot off the top of my head, the main things I look at. I look at project size. I look at the cost of the interconnection. I look at the cost to build the project. I look at what the project will generate in terms of kilowatt hours of electricity. And I will look at what we feel we can monetize that electricity for. Secondary items we look at, what's the cost of the ground lease? And what will the property taxes likely be? So those are like the general things that I think that I know I look at, but I think a lot of solar companies would consider right off the bat. So,
It's kind of in the interest of whether the project's really a go or a no-go.
but there's one other thing I look at is just the permitting feasibility. Like, are people gonna say okay to this? 5 years ago, I would not have had too much concern about that. You could plop down a solar project almost anywhere without too much pushback. You know, I think we spend a lot of time right now discussing, you know, route to site plan approval. And is this gonna work? You know, how friendly is the community to solar? What's the IDA like? You know, do we have any residential neighbors? You know, those are the softer things we look at. But on the quantifiable things, you know, those are always consistent, but now the softer issues are becoming a much more prevalent item that we have to consider.
I think we have time for one more question, Alex.
So this is a New York State specific question and for major renewable energy facilities, how does section 94C and like the new Office of Renewable Energy Siting come into play here? And can the developer build themselves to that streamlined process or have the Office of Renewable Energy Siting come into play here?
So I guess is the question, can you utilize that process for Brownfield and, you know,
You have to clean up the brownfield first and then go through that process, or can you do it simultaneously with the help of the ORES?
Dan, have you had that?
Well, I
Experience.
think, you know, the siting office for permitting, and maybe I'll explain what this office does. So large scale renewables, anything over 20 megawatts in size. None of those projects have been built yet to date in New York, but for the state to hit their renewable energy portfolio standard objectives, you know, these large scale projects need to go forward. The reason they haven't to date is because the local communities don't really want them there. So about a year and a half ago, Governor Cuomo established I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's a siting office. And basically the way it will work, I'm oversimplifying this, is that a project will be permitted after, I think, approximately a 12-month, it's not really a due diligence process, but a back and forth between the host communities and the developer. Basically, they're removing home rule. The attempt is to remove home rule from the permitting process. You know, your question is, you know, how does this office come into play when developing brownfield sites? First of all, this office is only working with projects that are at least 10 megawatts in size. Those size projects have the option of working with that office. Any project over 20 megawatts will work with that office. You know, I quite frankly don't know how many of those projects are going to be sited on brownfields, because most of those are sited in rural agricultural areas. So I can't answer that question very well. But I would imagine that any of the benefits that would be afforded to a developer associated with a brownfield project would also be able to do that on a large scale project as well.
Yeah, and I'll say, add one thing and then I'll go to the final question. I think more and more you are going to see within states these siting offices what some states call, Virginia, for example, calls permitting by rule. In Maryland, you have a CPCN process from the State Public Service Commission. And, I think it really is, and similar to what's happening in New York, it's having someone, one-stop shopping for permitting to streamline that, and I can tell you that one of the factors that they do look at is, is it sited on land that's going to have environmental considerations? Is it going to be something that is going to be, conflict with the local, local zoning or local preferences with respect to where projects should be? So I think we're going to see more and more of that. And again, I think a factor is going to be, is this being sited in a place that's the right place? And I say the right place for, for solar. Sir?
Yeah, in answer to that question before, ECP tax credits are transferable. Also, you have X number of years for your tangible credits. So somebody coming in afterwards can glom onto those tangible credits.
Thank you. All right, so I think that wraps it up. We're about maybe 8 minutes over, but I want to thank everyone who's in the room. Thank everyone who joined us via Zoom. I think we have about I'm seeing we've had about up to 50 participants. So I hope this was educational. And if for the people in the room, please feel free to hang around, chat, and discuss any of this or otherwise. Thank you. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to Mike and Mark. Do I just hit end?
Yeah.